An investigation has shown that groups funded by the OHCA and the WHO have links to the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who are a proscribed terrorist organisation. Can the Minister assure me that no UK aid money has been channelled in that way?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The UK has provided £840,000 to the WHO and UNICEF in response to COVID-19. We maintain robust measures to ensure that aid is not diverted, and we are determined to continue to play our responsible part in cross-government approaches to support the Palestinian people and also to work towards peace in the region.
Deanna Davison.
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bit of smart choreography there. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will group this question with question 15. Charities and NGOs are crucial partners for DFID and play a critical role in ensuring UK aid reaches the most vulnerable. We've used schemes such as our Rapid Response Facility to surge £45 million of special funding to them, and we want them to deliver some of the rest of the UK's £764 million coronavirus response. And where our charity partners are struggling, we have introduced a special procedure to make sure they remain our partners for the long term.
Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and many happy returns from the residents of Bishop Auckland. Earlier this week, members from across the House marked World Oceans Day, outlining how we can put nature at the heart of a clean and resilient recovery. So does my honourable friend agree with me that Durham University's Transforming Energy Access initiative will help deployment of renewable energy sources as part of the UK's ambitious climate change targets?
Minister.
Thank you. Increasing the deployment of clean energy is a key part of helping countries build back greener after the COVID-19 crisis. DFID's Transforming Energy Access programme, within which Durham University has played a valuable role, is supporting technology and business model innovations, accelerating access to affordable clean energy. It's already improved energy access for more than 5 million people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And this is the sort of ambition that we would be hoping to scale up from April 2020 under the Ayrton Fund.
Karen Buck.
Many happy returns, Mr. Speaker. UK-based international charities are under unprecedented pressure at a time when their services are most needed, with the latest research indicating that almost half of, or more than half, have cut back on their overseas programmes, and nearly half, particularly small organisations, are at risk of not surviving for another 6 months. Will the Minister ensure that the review that is going on into their work will ensure that the government begins by dealing with those with the lowest transparency scores and tackling those programmes which do not put poverty reduction at the heart of their work?
Thank you, and I ought to wish you happy birthday as well. Rather remiss of me there, Mr. Speaker. But my honourable friend, the honourable lady, makes a very important point here, and this is that civil society is an important policy and delivery partner for DFID, and I absolutely recognise the work that they do. And our continued partnership will be critical in ensuring that UK aid reaches those most in need as a result of COVID-19. There are a number of funding schemes and programmes that DFID has recently announced and allocated, and that includes a new £30 million UK Aid Direct funding round, which is open specifically for small and medium-sized charities, both based in the UK and internationally, to support the global response to COVID-19.
Okay. We now come to topicals, and I start with Ian Levy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday from Blythe Valley. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that in order to tackle this virus so that we can all be safe from future waves of infection,
Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to put on the record that Black Lives Matter, and we must listen to those communities that face discrimination and solve the unconscious biases which still create injustice and lost potential. So my department will redouble its efforts to drive out discrimination and supporting the poorest countries to achieve genuine mutual prosperity free of prejudice. That struggle for equality is exactly why it was so important last week that the UK brought together via video link the London 2020 Global Vaccine Summit as part of a 60-country effort. A historic £8.8 billion of dollars was raised to vaccinate the world's poorest people. Gavi will immunise 300 million more children as a result.
Leave it.
Sorry about that, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday again. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that in order to tackle this virus, so that we can all be safe from future waves of infection, the international community must work together, coordinating and increasing support for vulnerable countries, delivering the appropriate international financial and health system assistance? Thank you.
State.
Thank you. Strong and resilient health systems are vital to national and global health security and helping to protect the world from infectious diseases, including COVID. The UK has so far pledged £764 million of UK aid to help end the COVID-19 pandemic in support of a coordinated international response through the international financing institutions, multilaterals and global health initiatives alongside DFID programmes. Through our multilateral partnerships and our regional and national programmes, we support developing countries to make their domestic healthcare systems stronger and more resilient, and to better prepare for, prevent, detect and respond to health crises, including COVID.
Stephen Doherty.
Pembroke Hapis, Mr. Speaker. The UK's Commonwealth Development Corporation does important work, but deeply concerning evidence has come to light thanks to the work of Finance Uncovered regarding CDC investments in Myanmar, including $30 million in an internet service provider called Frontier, which at the orders of the Myanmar government has blocked independent news sites reporting on atrocities taking place against the Rohingya. Will she now urge CDC to immediately divest from this company? And is she sure that none of the other microfinance programmes being supported are indirectly helping the Myanmar regime?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government condemns any action to restrict the freedom of expression of journalists and has repeatedly raised the issue of internet restrictions and shutdowns at the highest level with the Myanmar government. But after going through due diligence, CDC invested in Frontier to extend internet access to more people in Myanmar and combat poverty. The company has followed the International Global Network Initiative standards by posting transparency statements so users know if the site has limitations upon it.
Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and wishing you a Boston birthday from the Black Country. Mr. Speaker, I was recently lobbied by a Year 12 student from Wednesbury called Queenie who wanted to ensure that no one in the world cannot access a vaccine. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, in addition to being the largest funder of Garvey now, what additional work is the UK doing and what message would she have for Queenie to ensure that she can carry on in her fight to make sure that everyone can access vaccines globally?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Queenie is clearly a wise young person, and it's a really, really important question. The UK is at the forefront of efforts to drive global collaboration and resourcing, including through our engagement with the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator and industry for the development of new vaccines at the speed and scale required to ensure access for all those who will need them. As well as contributing £1.65 billion to fund Garvey's core programme, we have committed £48 million to their newly launched COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, aimed at incentivising manufacturers to produce sufficient quantities of a potential vaccine to ensure future access for those low and middle income countries.
4 is withdrawn, so we go to Lawrence Robertson down in Tewkesbury. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, and happy birthday from Tewkesbury, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Secretary of State, many people in East Africa have suffered from food insecurity for very many years, and of course the challenges have been multiplied very recently. Could she give us a quick assessment of the position in East Africa and what the government is doing to help people there?
State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is proud to support the World Food Programme with £500 million last year, the UN Food and Agriculture Organisation with £40 million, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development with over £50 million in their efforts to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition across Africa. We are also assisting countries to respond to the desert locust upsurge in East Africa, which threatens 25 million people with severe food shortages. UK aid has funded a supercomputer to track and help develop early warning systems, and UK aid has provided £5 million to the UN's FAO Regional Emergency Appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In addition to the point made by my honourable friend, will the Secretary of State urge the Commonwealth Development Corporation to avoid investments which involve making, selling or utilising single-use plastic packaging?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the honourable gentleman that all government departments are closely integrated in the work of both humanitarian aid, economic development and improving our planet. The work of my right honourable friend, Lord Goldsmith from the other place, means that we are fully integrated in ensuring that economic development is not done at the cost to the environment and the planet.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. I call the Prime Minister to answer the engagements question from Vicky Foxcroft. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we approach the 3rd anniversary this coming Sunday of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, I know that the whole House would wish to join me in sending our heartfelt sympathies and thoughts to the families and friends of the 72 people who lost their lives and to the survivors. Across government, we remain committed to ensuring that such a tragedy can never happen again. Mr. Speaker, members from across the House will want to join me in offering our very best wishes to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh on his 99th birthday. And I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, the whole House will also want to join me in wishing you, Mr. Speaker, a very happy birthday. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you. Thank you for all the kind regards. We're going across to Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a shielded person, I'm grateful to once again contribute to Parliament. Many shielded people have contacted me, worried about government guidance on going for walks. They want a safe hour walk for shielded people, similar to that adopted in many other countries. Will he do that? They also want more transparency on the shielding list with each category named and risks published. Will he provide that? And finally, will he agree to review the furlough scheme so shielded people in the future are not penalised?
Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable lady that we certainly will be doing as much as we can in the near future to ensure shielded people get guidance about how they can come out of their shielded environment safely in a way that is COVID secure. And on her point about furlough, it's a very important one, and clearly newly shielded people may be asking themselves whether they will be entitled to furlough funds. I've been made aware of the issue very recently. I can assure her that we will be addressing it forthwith.
Gerald Mayo.
Thank you, sir. The threatened breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration for Hong Kong is just the latest evidence of China's increasingly overt rejection of the rules of international fair play. The Communist Party of China expresses derision for the West's short-termism and lack of unity, so let's prove them wrong. Would my right honourable friend consider publishing a consultation paper for the development of a long-term strategy for our national and pan-national engagement with China?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps it would be helpful in advance of any consultation paper if I just set out my own broad position and stress that I am a Sinophile, and I believe that we must continue to work with this great and rising power. But when we have, on climate change or trade or whatever it happens to be, but when we have serious concerns as a country, we must, whether it's over the origins of COVID or the protection of our critical national infrastructure, or indeed over what is happening in Hong Kong, then we must feel absolutely free to raise those issues loud and clear with Beijing, and that is what we will continue to do.
Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister on his comments on Grenfell, a dreadful night, and his comments on the Duke of Edinburgh, and of course his best wishes to you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also say I listened carefully to what the Prime Minister just said on furlough for those newly shielding, and can I welcome that? That has been something we've been concerned about. We'll look at the proposal when it's put on the table, but I'm grateful that he's listened to that and for what he said this morning. The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, on Monday said that feelings of black and minority ethnic groups about discrimination are founded on a cold reality. I agree with him about that. There have been at least 7 reports into racial inequality in the last 3 years alone, but precious little action. For example, most of the recommendations in the Lamy report into inequality in the criminal justice system have yet to be implemented 3 years after the report was published. Similarly, the long-delayed and damning report by Wendy Williams into the Windrush scandal has yet to be implemented. I spoke last night to black community leaders, and they had a very clear message for the Prime Minister. Implement the reports you've already got. So can the Prime Minister now turbocharge the government's responses and tell us when he'll implement in full the Lamy report and the Windrush recommendations?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and of course I understand, as I said, I understand the very strong and legitimate feelings of people in this country at the death of George Floyd, and of course I agree that Black Lives Matter, and we are getting on with the implementation, not just of the Lamy report, but also the report into Windrush. For instance, on the Lamy report, for which this government commissioned, and for which I thank the honourable member for Tottenham, we are increasing already the number of black and minority ethnic people in the prison service, as David Lammy recommended. We are increasing the use of body-worn cameras, and we are trying to ensure, amongst other things, that young BNE people are not immediately prosecuted as a result of the trouble they find themselves in, and we try to make sure that we give people a chance. But I must stress that on the Lamy report and on all these matters, it is absolutely vital at the same time that we keep our streets safe and that we back our police. And that is what we are going to do.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome what the Prime Minister says about implementing the reports, and obviously we'll hold him to it. He will appreciate that people do notice when recommendations are made and then not implemented, so it's very important that they are implemented in accordance with those reports. Mr. Speaker, the latest report is the Public Health England report on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. That report concluded that death rates are highest amongst black and Asian ethnic groups. And it went on to say, and this was the important bit, that it's already clear that relevant guidance and key policies should be adapted to mitigate the risk. Already clear. If it is already clear that guidance and policy need to be changed, why has the government not already acted?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only is it already clear, but we are already acting. And I can tell him that what we are doing, as a result of the report by Professor Fenton, which again we commissioned, we are looking at the particular exposure of black and minority ethnic groups to coronavirus, and be in no doubt they've been at the forefront of the struggle against coronavirus, whether it's in the NHS or in public transport. 44% of the NHS in London, or London workforce, is black and minority ethnic workers, and that is why what we are doing first and most directly is to ensure that those high contact professions get expanded and targeted testing now. And that's what I've agreed with Dido Harding from NHS Test and Trace. I think that's the first and most practical step we can take as a result of Professor Fenton's report.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Prime Minister, I know, understands the frustration from those most at risk when they see a report like that and they know action is needed. And action is needed now, not in a few weeks or months. So can I ask the Prime Minister to complete, well, perhaps the Prime Minister will indicate whether that's all of the action or whether there's more action. This is a serious issue. We can make progress together. But it is important that it's done swiftly for those most at risk. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to the overall numbers of those that have tragically died from COVID-19, because those overall numbers haunt us. Since last Prime Minister's questions, the government's daily total figure for those that have died from coronavirus has gone past 40,000. The ONS figure, which records cases where coronavirus is on the death certificate, stands at just over 50,000. And the number of excess deaths, which is an awful phrase, stands at over 63,000. These are amongst the highest numbers anywhere in the world. Last week, the Prime Minister said he was proud of the government's record. But there's no pride in those figures, is there?
Mr. Speaker, let me just say that on the death figures for this country, we mourn everyone, and we grieve for them and for their relatives and their friends. But I must also tell him, and he's raised this point repeatedly across the dispatch box, the best scientific evidence and advice is that we must wait until the epidemic has been through its whole cycle in order to draw the relevant international comparisons. And that, I'm afraid, I simply must repeat that point to him. And as for the what this country did to fight the epidemic, I must say I strongly disagree with the way he characterises it. I think it was an astonishing achievement of the NHS to build the Nightingale hospitals. I think it was an astonishing thing that this country came together to drive down, to follow the social distancing rules, in spite of all the doubt that was cast on the advice, to follow those rules, to get the number of deaths down, to get the epidemic under control in the way that we have. And this government has announced a plan on May the 11th to get our country back onto its feet, and that is what we are going to do. We have a plan, we're following it, and we're going to stick to it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it just doesn't wash to say that we can't compare these figures to other countries. Everybody can see those figures and see the disparity, and we need to learn from those other countries. What did they do more quickly than us? What did they do differently to us? Because we can learn those lessons and ensure that the numbers come down. And it's little solace to the families that have lost someone to simply be told this is too early to compare and to learn from other countries. And of course there will be long-term consequences as a result of the government's approach. I want to turn now to another aspect of government policy, and that's school reopening. We all want as many children back into school as soon as it's possible and as soon as it's safe. What that required for that to happen was a robust national plan, consensus among all key stakeholders, and strong leadership from the top. All three are missing. The current arrangements lie in tatters. Parents have lost confidence in the government's approach. Millions of children will miss 6 months' worth of schooling, and inequality will now go up. Several weeks ago, I suggested to the Prime Minister that we set up a national task force so everybody could put their shoulder to the wheel. It's not too late. Will the Prime Minister take me up on this?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I told the House before, I've been in contact with the Right Honourable Gentleman by a modern device called the telephone, in which we've tried to agree a way forward, which he's then seemed to deviate from later on. Last week he was telling the House that it was not yet safe for kids to go back to school. This week he's saying that not enough kids are going back to school. I really think he needs to make up his mind. And since he's so fond of these international comparisons, he should know that there are some countries in the EU, in Europe, where no primary school kids are going back to school. I think, and we are being extremely cautious in our approach. We're following the plan that we set out, and I think that the people of this country will want to follow it. And all the evidence cites 97% of the schools that have submitted data are now seeing kids come back to school. And I think what we would like to hear from the Right Honourable Gentleman is a bit of support for that, and a bit of encouragement to pupils, and perhaps even encouragement to some of his friends in the left-wing trades unions to help get our schools ready.
Keir Starmer.
Have this out. The Prime Minister and I have never discussed our letter in any phone call. He knows it and I know it. The task force has never been the subject of a conversation between him and me one-to-one or in any other circumstance on the telephone. He knows it, so please drop that. Secondly, he mentions other countries. Plenty of other comparable countries are getting their children back to school. Wales is an example. Across Europe, there are other examples. We're the outlier on this. And it's no good, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister flailing around trying to blame others.
Order. We need to get through with lots of other members, so if we can listen to the question, then I certainly want to hear the answers. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I was saying it's no good the Prime Minister flailing around trying to blame others. A month ago today, he made the announcement about schools without consulting relevant parties, without warning about the dates, and without any scientific backing for his proposal. It's time he took responsibility for his own failures. This mess was completely avoidable. The consequences are stark. The Children's Commissioner has warned of a deepening education disadvantage gap. And she spoke yesterday, her words, the Children's Commissioner, an emerging picture which doesn't give confidence that there's a strategic plan. She called for the government to scale up their response. It must have occurred. It must have occurred to the government that space would be a problem, that there would be a need for temporary accommodation and classrooms. They built the Nightingale hospitals. Why are they only starting on schools now?
Mr. Speaker, he still can't work out whether he's saying schools are not safe enough or whether we should be going back more quickly. I mean, he can't have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. It's one brief one day, another brief the next. I understand how the legal profession works, but what the public want to have is some consistency, Mr. Speaker. And what I hope that he will agree with me is that it's a good thing that we've now got 37% of kids in Year 6 in our primary schools coming back. That is increasing the whole time. And what I think the message that I think that teachers want to hear across the country is that all parliamentarians in this House of Commons support the return of kids to school. And furthermore, that they are encouraging kids to come back to school because it is safe. Will he now say that?
Keir Starmer.
I want as many children to go back to school as possible, as soon as possible, as quickly as possible when it's safe. I've been saying that like a broken record for weeks on end. I know the Prime Minister's got rehearsed attack lines, but he should look at what I wrote from this letter and what I've been saying consistently. Mr. Speaker, one way in which the government could help those worst affected would be to extend the national voucher scheme. Because child poverty numbers are so high in this country, 1.3 million children in low-income families rely on these vouchers. They mean children who can't go to school because of coronavirus restrictions still get free meals. The Labour government in Wales has said it will continue to fund these meals through the summer. Yesterday, the Education Secretary said that won't be the case in England. That's just wrong, and it will lead to further inequality. So can I urge the Prime Minister to reconsider on this point?
Prime Minister.
What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is, of course, we don't normally continue with free school meals over the summer holidays, but we are also, of course, and I'm sure that's right, we're also, of course, aware of the particular difficulties faced by vulnerable families, and that's why we're announcing a further £63 million of local welfare assistance to be used by local authorities at their discretion to help the most vulnerable families, Mr. Speaker. This government has put its arms round the people of this country throughout this crisis and has done its absolute best, to help, And I may say it is not helped by the wobbling and tergiversation of the Labour Party and the gentleman opposite. First he says last week he says it's not safe. This week he says we're not going fast enough. We protected the NHS, Mr. Speaker. We provided huge numbers of ventilated beds. We're now getting the disease under control, but we will do it in a cautious and contingent way. And today I will be announcing further measures to open up our society and to unlock our society, but only because of the huge efforts and the sacrifice that this country has made. We're sticking to our plan of May the 11th. We're sticking to our plan. It's a plan that is working and will continue to work, Mr. Speaker, with or without the assistance of the right honourable gentleman opposite.
Alan Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Britain's new Advanced Research Projects Agency is vital to securing our status as a science and technology superpower, particularly as we recover from coronavirus. Can my right honourable friend commit to protecting its funding and its independence so there are no obstacles to it delivering transformational breakthroughs from clean energy to new vaccines?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Yes, and I thank my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. We will be having an advanced research projects agency funded to the tune of £800 million, and it will be tasked with supporting really revolutionary breakthroughs in this country, because it was the UK, from splitting the atom to the jet engine to the internet, that has led the world in scientific research, and under this government we intend to continue.
We're now heading up into Scotland to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on Grenfell, of course, on the birthday of the Duke of Edinburgh, and yourself. And, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told the Liaison Committee, I do not actually read the scientific papers. It is no wonder then, Mr. Speaker, that it took the UK so long to act on quarantine measures. The Prime Minister's scientific advisory group weren't even asked for advice on this significant policy. This has been a complete shambles. Too little, too late. We cannot risk ignoring the experts once again. Can the Prime Minister confirm what scientific papers he has read on the 2-metre social distance rule?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I disagree with him. I've read a huge amount about a disease that affects our entire nation. I've read many papers actually on the social distancing rule, and it's a very interesting point. And I think members across the House of Commons will want to understand that I believe that those measures, the 2-metre rule, needs now to be kept under review. As we drive this disease down, as we get the incidence down, working together, I want to make sure that we keep that 2-metre rule under constant review, because as the right honourable gentleman I think indicates, there is all sorts of scientific advice about that particular matter.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we know that the Cabinet has discussed reducing the 2-metre social distancing rule, but that's not the experts' advice right now. SAGE reported that being exposed to the virus for 6 seconds at 1 metre is the same as being exposed for 1 minute at 2 metres. That, Mr. Speaker, is a significant increase in risk. And the last time Professor Whitty was allowed to attend the daily press briefing, he stressed that the 2-metre rule was going to be necessary for as long as the pandemic continues. People are losing confidence in this government. A U-turn on schools, a shambolic rollout of quarantine measures, and now looking to reduce the 2-metre rule far too soon. Will the Prime Minister continue to ignore the experts, or will he start following the advice of those who've actually read the scientific papers?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, the people of this country are overwhelmingly following the guidance that this government gives. And tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, the House will be hearing a bit more about what's happened with NHS Test and Trace, and they will find an extraordinary degree of natural compliance, natural understanding by the British people, in spite of all the obscurantism and the myth-making that we've heard from the parties opposite. And I can tell the right honourable gentleman that there are all sorts of views about the 2-metre rule. He's absolutely correct in what he says about the SAGE advice, but clearly, as the incidence of the disease comes down, as I think members of SAGE would confirm, the statistical likelihood of being infected, no matter how close or far you are from somebody who may or may not have coronavirus, goes down.
Peter Aldis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Allowing zoos such as Africa Alive near Lowestoft to reopen from 15th June is very good news, as it provides them with a realistic chance of survival. Would the Prime Minister give full consideration to allowing beer gardens to also reopen from 15th June, as the feedback which I'm receiving is that many pubs are now facing the unpalatable and unwanted prospect of having to make staff redundant?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend very much, because he's absolutely right. We want to reopen hospitality as quickly as we possibly can. The House will remember that according to the roadmap, we were going to open outdoor hospitality no earlier than July the 4th. That is still the plan. We are sticking to our plan. And so guidance is now being developed for such hospitality. What we don't want to see is a roiling Bacchanalian mass of people that can spread the disease. So it's very important that people understand the continuing risks that this country faces.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
The Prime Minister will be aware that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has today published the guidelines for the special payment scheme for severely injured victims linked to the troubles in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister will also know that this House passed legislation which excludes those injured by their own hand. But the innocent victims have not yet been able to benefit from this scheme, not least because of the actions of Sinn Féin, who are blocking the next steps to implementation. Will the Prime Minister and his government now commit to do all that they can to move this matter forward so that our most vulnerable of innocent victims can receive this pension?
Prime Minister. Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I think this scheme provides a fair, balanced and proportionate way of helping all those who suffered most during the Troubles, and it's very important that Sinn Féin, along with all other parties, allow the scheme to go forward as soon as possible.
Maria Miller.
Mr. Speaker, many peaceful protests have been held across the country against racism following the appalling events in the US, including in my own constituency yesterday. Can I commend my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for recognising the significance of these events? And as well as scrutinising the health impact of C19 on ethnic minority groups, can he look again, using the race disparity audit, for any persistent and systemic racism in all government departments, from the treatment of BAME people in the judicial system through to how we teach children about these issues in our education system?
Minister. Well, I thank her, and I completely agree with the need for all political leaders to promote these issues, to recognise how important they are in people's hearts, and we will continue. I'm very proud of what I did as Mayor to encourage the promotion of young BAME officers in our Metropolitan Police. We had a system to move them up. I want to see that kind of activity across the government of this country. It's the right way forward for the UK.
Returning to Scotland with Kirsty Blackman. Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, the response from the US President to the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement has been horrendous. Can the Prime Minister confirm to me if he still believes Trump has many, many good qualities? And if so, what are they?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I renew what I have said many times, but it's important for the House to hear it again. Yes, Black Lives Matter, and yes, the death of George Floyd was absolutely appalling. And as for the qualities of Mr. Trump, let me say he has, amongst many other things, he is President of the United States, which is our most important ally in the world today. And whatever people may say about it, whatever those on the left may say about it, the United States is a bastion of peace and freedom, and has been for most of my lifetime.
Power of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I hope you'll allow me to ask the Prime Minister also to welcome the birthday of the Primate of England, the 2007 Yorkshireman of the Year, the Archbishop of York, who's just laying down his crozier after 14 years of service. His great words that we can share the glories, the struggles, the joys and the pains of this country. Remembering that John Sentamu was tortured in Uganda and served in Tulse Hill, Stepney, Birmingham, as well as York, and was a critical advisor to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Can I put it to my right honourable friend that if in a period of 8 years there are 8 interrogations of a bishop, each time John Sentamu, we've got more to learn about making the colour of one's skin as important as the colour of one's eyes or the colour of one's hair, something you may notice but doesn't tell you any more about them.
Minister.
Well, I join him warmly in paying tribute to the Archbishop of York as he lays down his crozier. He and I correspond very often. I take his advice and very sincerely, and I had no idea that today was such a distinguished birthday, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, under suspicionless stop and search powers, which this government is expanding, a black person is 47 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. 47 times. On too many occasions, stop and search seems to mean being black is enough to be suspected of being a criminal. So will the Prime Minister abolish suspicionless stop and search powers and end the pain and injustice they wreak on so many people in Britain's black and minority communities?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's very important that stop and search is carried out sensitively in accordance with the law. It has made a great difference to the way it happens that we now have body-worn cameras, but I must say I do think that it can be a very Section 60 powers can be very important in fighting violent crime, and I'm afraid that what has been happening in London with knife crime has been completely unacceptable, and I do believe that stop and search, amongst many other things, can be a very important utensil of fighting knife crime. It does work. It worked for us when I was running London, and it must work now. I'm not saying it's the whole answer. He's right. It's not the whole answer, but it's part of the mix.
We're now heading up to the County Palatine of Lancashire with Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hospitality and tourism businesses on the Fylde Coast are concerned about their path to long-term recovery and the infrastructure needed to support that. Centrally to this locally is the M55 Link Road, a project which was fully funded and had an issue with some funding allocations. Can the Prime Minister put his weight behind this and help me secure the £5.7 million needed to complete the shovel-ready project?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can say is that we will unite and level up with infrastructure projects across our country, and I congratulate him in his lobbying for this particular scheme, and I can tell him that last year we put £31 million for the Preston Western Distributor Scheme, which is a new dual carriageway that will reduce congestion in Preston and directly lead to the creation of over 3,000 houses and over 500 jobs. And as for further expansion of the M55, he will have to wait, but there will be further announcements in due course.
We're now heading up into Scotland with Stuart Malcolm MacDonald. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Even before the pandemic began, it was clear that the UK has one of the most manifestly inadequate systems of statutory sick pay in the world. We are the second from the bottom in European terms, and it continues to shun millions of workers who are low earners, work in the gig economy, or are self-employed. So as we come back from the crisis in economic terms and make the workplace better, will the Prime Minister agree to work with those of us in the opposition to see a system fit for the 21st century that can meet people's needs?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and we will make sure that those who do not have, yes, of course, statutory sick pay is an important part of the way we tackle the problems of self-isolation and all the issues that are faced by people facing coronavirus. But people also receive additional funds. I think anybody looking impartially at what we're doing to support the people of this country throughout this epidemic will concede that the UK has done more than virtually any other country on earth to look after the people of this country, whether through the furloughing scheme or the bounce back loans or anything else. And listening to him just now, I've also pledged that we are going to put in gigabit broadband across the whole of the UK so that he can be heard more clearly in future.
Heading up to the border of Manchester and Lancashire with Mark Logan.
Prime Minister, we've seen much disinformation about the R value in Bolton and the North West. If we have increasingly up-to-date local data, would the Prime Minister then agree with me that correspondingly greater confidence will be given to Boltonians in reopening our businesses, schools and places of worship?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I am encouraged by NHS Test and Trace and the progress that it is making, and with the help of the Joint Biosecurity Centre, we're able now to identify hotspots, to do whack-a-mole and to stamp out on outbreaks of the epidemic where they occur.
Returning to Scotland with Kenny McCaskill. Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. East Lothian prides itself on its food and drink sector, which is gravely threatened by reduced standards in animal welfare and production. The government failed to enshrine protections in the Agriculture Bill. Earlier this week, ministers equivocated on this issue. Will the Prime Minister now take this opportunity to be clear today that high standards will be protected, a Food Standards Commission will be established, and that we won't face chlorinated chicken on our table, along with Kentucky Fried Medicine in our hospitals?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only will we protect animal welfare standards, but we will be able, on leaving the EU as we have, we will be able to increase our animal welfare standards. We will be able to ban treatment of farrowing sows that is currently legal in the EU. We will be able to ban the shipment of live animals, which we currently cannot ban in the UK. We will be able to go further, and I hope, by the way, that he supports it, and I hope he'll tell all his friends in the SNP, I hope he'll tell all his friends in the SNP that that's one of the reasons why their plan to take Scotland back into the EU would be completely contrary to the instincts of the British people.
Mr. Speaker, due to COVID, we're facing a unique economic challenge. Can I urge the Prime Minister to respond with a major package of infrastructure investment to create jobs and level up the whole country, including turbocharging the rollout of gigabit broadband, upgrading the Manchester to Sheffield line, and finally building the full Mottram bypass? The people of Glossop have been promised this by politicians for over 50 years. We'll even let him call it the Boris bypass. Let's please just get it built.
And he can use his bike. Come on, Prime Minister.
OK, well, thank you so much. And my honourable friend, I can confirm briefly to my honourable friend that we are indeed committed under the road investment strategy published last year to building a bypass around Mottram, and I look forward to being there to see it done.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents tell me they've lost trust in the government as they're confused by mixed messaging around public health measures, angry that Dominic Cummings seems to have been let off the hook, but they're particularly worried about local jobs and livelihoods due to inadequate support schemes, lack of crisis funding for Luton Council, illogical quarantine impacting Luton Airport. All of this has been on your watch, Prime Minister. How can my constituents feel confident on the proposed next steps for easing lockdown when your government has fallen short so far?
Prime Minister.
Because I think the British public, with their overwhelming common sense, have ignored some of the propaganda that we've been hearing from the party opposite about our advice. They've ignored the negativity and the attempts to confuse, and they are overwhelmingly following advice. And indeed, they are complying with NHS test and trace, which is the way forward, which will enable us to defeat this virus both locally and nationally.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pre-COVID, the Prime Minister has made a firm commitment to reach into some of the most deprived areas and level up the country. This is needed now more than ever. Will he make a firm commitment and recommit to Whitmarines, Chapel Ash, Penfield and the rest of Wolverhampton so they won't just survive, they will thrive?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly will. I congratulate my honourable friend on the way he represents Wolverhampton and the many campaigns that he fights for that great city. And I can tell him that, just as for starters, that Wolverhampton will benefit from around 217 million of the growth deal funding across the Black Country, which aims to create 5,000 jobs, 1,400 new homes and 310 million in public and private investment, just for starters.
Final question, Olivia.
And many happy returns, Mr. Speaker. Today they say that we are free just to be only to be chained in poverty. Figures, not my words, the words of Bob Marley in 1973. Figures from the Trussell Trust show an 89% increase in emergency food parcels across the UK in April compared to the same month last year. People are struggling and they need help now. Will the Prime Minister meet with the Chancellor, charities and local government leaders to discuss a much-needed funding boost for local welfare assistance schemes in England?
Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, the honourable lady is absolutely right. This country is going through a very difficult crisis, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and of course it's put many families to great hardship. I think the government has done a huge amount to look after families across the country. We put, as she knows, £3.2 billion more into local government. And I announced earlier on today, just now, that we're also putting another £63 million into extra welfare support for particularly disadvantaged families to help with meals throughout the summer period. But she's entirely right. We face a huge economic problem. That's why we need to get moving, get this country going forward together, and work as parliamentarians and politicians to communicate to the public jointly what we're doing.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Thank you. Order! Honourable members will know that preparations are underway for the new division systems using pass readers in the division lobbies. Based on the tests so far and the best professional advice, I have concluded that we cannot use the new system today, but I will make a further statement on Monday. We now come to the urgent question to ask the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy what steps the Government is taking to support sub-postmasters wrongly convicted of Post Office Horizon scandal. I now call Siomwara to ask her urgent question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I wish you a very happy birthday and many returns of the day. So to To ask the Secretary of State what steps the government is taking to support sub-postmasters wrongly convicted in the Post Office Horizon scandal.
I now call the Minister with 3 minutes to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. I've listened to a number of postmasters' stories personally, and indeed seen the recent Panorama programme, and it's impossible to ignore the negative impact that the Horizon dispute and court case has had on affected postmasters' lives, their livelihoods, their financial situation, their reputations, and for some also, as we know, their physical and mental health. Convicted claimants seeking to have their conviction overturned are going through a further process with the Criminal Case Review Commission, who have the power to refer cases to the Court of Appeal to consider whether any convictions are unsafe. As you'll appreciate, it's important that the government does not seek to influence this process or comment on any individual cases there. I can confirm, though, that the Post Office is cooperating with the CCRC to the fullest extent, and the government is monitoring this. 47 out of the 61 CCRC cases have now been referred to the Court of Appeal, and it's for the courts to decide whether the convictions are unsafe. But let me also acknowledge the strength of feeling on all sides of the House on this matter, which has been evident in the debates I've participated in earlier this year and correspondence that I've had from many, many members. And that's why government is committed to establishing an independent review to consider whether the Post Office has learnt the necessary lessons from the Horizon dispute and court case, and to provide an independent and external assessment of its work to rebuild its relationship with its postmasters. Full details of the terms of reference for that independent review are set out in a written ministerial statement that I laid in the House this morning. We're keen to see this review launch as soon as possible, and we're in the process of identifying a chair to lead the work of the review.
Thank you. Chair Mora.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Post Office Horizon scandal may well be the largest miscarriage of justice in our history. 900 prosecutions, each one its own story of dreams crushed, careers ruined, families destroyed, reputation smashed and lives lost. Innocent people bankrupted and imprisoned. Does the Minister agree that Monday's Panorama programme adds to the sense of a cover-up on a grand scale in the Post Office, a trusted national institution, and all because of the failings in the Post Office Horizon system? For over a decade, the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance campaigned to get at the truth, but the Post Office denied all wrongdoings, imposing huge lawyers' fees on the claimants. Justice Fraser's High Court ruling in December paved the way finally for justice for some, but the mediated settlement means the truth remains hidden. Will the Minister agree there can be no justice without truth? So many questions remain unanswered. When did the Post Office know the Horizon system could cause money to disappear? And what responsibility did the developer Fujitsu have? What did ministers to whom the Post Office is accountable do, and what did they know? Who was responsible for innocent people going to jail? Have they been held accountable, and will all victims be properly compensated? 3 months ago, the Prime Minister committed to a public inquiry, but we now hear that this is to consider whether the Post Office has learned the necessary lessons. We need an inquiry not simply to learn lessons, but to get to the truth. Only a judge-led inquiry can do that, with the Post Office compelled to cooperate. Will the Minister now agree to the judge-led inquiry we need? It is the very least the victims deserve. We need answers, not more delay. We will not rest until we get this, and justice for all those wronged in this scandal.
Minister Scully.
Thank you, and I welcome the lady to her place, and I appreciate her comments there. A public inquiry, according to Jason Beer QC, one of the leading experts on this, talks about what happened, why did it happen, who is to blame, and what can be done to prevent it from happening again. This independent review, chaired by someone independent from both the government and the Post Office, will indeed look to do that, to understand and acknowledge what went wrong in relation to the Horizon system by drawing on the evidence of those people who, as we have discussed, have been wronged in this situation, using both Justice Fraser's judgment and words and his own evidence that he will call upon. Government wants to be fully assured, I want to be fully assured, that the right lessons are learnt for the future and concrete changes have taken place at Post Office Limited to ensure that it doesn't be repeated. We want to be sure that through this review there's a public summary of the failings that occurred at Post Office Limited, drawing on the judgments and listening to those, as I say, have been most affected. This is the purpose of the independent review we're in the process of setting up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely right that we acknowledge the injustices that was done at the time. I remember having conversations, having spent a bit of time in post offices in my time with sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, and they acknowledged to me that they couldn't get their books to balance at the end of particular days, and they were really worried about it at that time. But it's worth remembering that the post office network is made up of sub-postmasters, and they need our support at this moment in time. So what can the department do to ensure that our sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses that are working around the country have the ability to be able to continue while this Horizon scandal is taking place?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. Government provided nearly £2 billion for the period 2010 to 18 and is investing a further £370 million from April 2018 to 21 to invest in the transformation of the business. A negotiated agreement was secured with all 28 UK banks in 2019 and took effect in 2020. That's resulted in a significant increase to the overall fees received by the Post Office from the banks, which will rise further if transaction volumes continue to grow. We've also encouraged the Post Office to strengthen its relationship with postmasters and postmaster training to foster a stronger commercial partnership. We've recently put in place personalised support for postmasters. If we are going to get the future relationship with postmasters right, we've got to, yes, tackle these injustices that have happened in the past, but we've also got to rebuild, with the new management in the Post Office, trust and training and respect for the sub-postmasters of the future.
We now come to the SNP spokesperson, Patricia Gibson, with 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can all agree with the Minister that the reputations, mental health and lives of the victims of this scandal have been ruined. Alan Bates, the former sub-postmaster who led the legal case against the Post Office, has been clear that the Post Office has not changed. Now, it's been 6 months since judges found major issues, including an excessive culture of secrecy, confidentiality, generally in the Post Office, but specifically relating around Horizon. So can the Minister explain why we still aren't getting a public inquiry into the scandal? The Prime Minister's told this House on the 26th of February that such an inquiry would be established, but the proposal set out by the Minister today falls short of that. And we welcome the BIS inquiry into this issue, but we really need a full independent public inquiry. And finally, does the Minister understand the anger and disappointment at the length of time it is taking to get the truth about one of the largest miscarriages of justice in the UK's history, amidst very serious allegations of perjury being levelled against Fujitsu's employees, the company behind the system? And will the Minister apologise to the hundreds of postmasters whose lives have been ruined, who've lost their homes, their livelihoods, their reputations as a result of inaction by this government?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that question. And the review that we've put in place, that we're putting in train, covers the areas that a public inquiry will achieve. We want to find out exactly what's going on. We don't want to duplicate the effort. We already have a number of words from Justice Fraser that point to exactly where the chairman of the independent review needs to look. In terms of the fact that this has happened, and this is a situation that's been going on for some 20-odd years, it is disgraceful that it's taken this time for Alan Bates and his fellow group litigants to actually get to a settlement, and that so many people have had to suffer as a result. What I'm keen to do now in the short tenure so far in this role is to push on and to make sure that they can get the answers that they need.
Mary Robinson.
It's clear that the Post Office concealed evidence that would have cleared sub-postmasters who were convicted and had their lives ruined. A major part of the evidence came from a Fujitsu whistleblower who revealed that Post Office accounts could be changed remotely from Fujitsu offices. Some postmasters now have the opportunity to sue the Post Office for malicious prosecution, but while those who were subject to criminal proceedings are able to make claims, people who brought civil claims which have been settled cannot. This was clearly not the intention of the court. So how can such a disparity in outcome be justified?
Well, in terms of the whistleblower, I know that Justice Fraser recommended a number of individuals to the Criminal Prosecution Service, and that will follow its train accordingly. In terms of the group litigation, the settlement was agreed with the Post Office, and that included legal and all other costs. So in that circumstances, government can't accept any further requests for payments. But if postmasters who have been convicted have their convictions overturned, there is a process in place for them to receive compensation if appropriate.
Chair of the Select Committee, Durham Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that my committee is undertaking an inquiry on the Post Office Horizon scandal, and it's a matter of regret that we were unable to take oral evidence from Mr. Reid, the current CEO of the Post Office, Ms. Fennells, the former CEO, and Fujitsu as planned on the 24th of March because of the lockdown. The sub-postmasters who have suffered such a depth of injustice, such a wide range of harm, will no doubt be welcoming the news today of the Minister's inquiry. But can you confirm to the House that that inquiry will have sufficient power to compel the disclosure of documentary evidence and to compel witnesses to come before it to give evidence in public?
Minister. I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's question, and I look forward to, I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend that session for the same reason, but I hope in the future to engage fully with the committee. And I think this is the key thing for the Post Office. The Post Office has said, and I will make sure, the best of my ability, to make sure that they will disclose everything. As I say, I saw the same panorama programme as he did when there was a big discussion and a lot of piece about non-disclosure. This cannot happen again. We have to draw that line and make sure that we do get answers. The chairman of that independent review will push for that. I will push for that. And I've already said that they will comply appropriately.
On the Post Office to apologise to all those who they have wronged and to pay generous compensation to them in the circumstances. Will the Minister put the government's voice behind that and make that a demand of the Post Office?
The Post Office have acknowledged mistakes within the settlement, the case that we've had. In terms of the group litigation, as I said, both parties, I'm glad that both parties were able to reach a settlement. Other postmasters who have had maybe suffered a shortfall will be able to take advantage of the historic shortfall scheme that the Post Office has launched, so that they can come forward and that be investigated and hopefully those wrongs righted.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Myself and the member from North West Durham and Lord Arbuthnot have been campaigning for this for over 7 years. People's have been imprisoned. People's lives have been ruined, both financially and mentally. They are being treated, I've said on record before, in a way a totalitarian state would treat people. The fact of the matter is, Minister, only a judge-led inquiry will get to the bottom of what is needed. I've cross-examined many of his predecessors over the last 7 years. Please, can I urge him to actually insist on that, because without that, we'll not get to the truth. And it is not just the Post Office to blame here, it's the government as well, because government ministers who've got shareholder representation on that board have sat back and done absolute nothing, including last year allowing the Post Office to spend over £100 million of public money to try and bankrupt the Justice for Postmasters thing. That is a disgrace which also needs to be exposed.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I acknowledge his long-standing campaigning on behalf of the Horizon postmasters, which is to be welcomed. I was shocked and surprised when I saw the revelations as I took over, and indeed continue to see the stories. The terms of reference of this review is the same as a public inquiry. It's to work out who is to blame. Can it happen again? How can we prevent it from happening again? What the wrongs were, and let's get those righted. The fact is that the chairman will be independent of both the Post Office and government. In terms of the government's roles as the shareholder, clearly the Post Office has operational independence, but there's been numerous attempts over the years to try and resolve the dispute, including an independent investigation in 2013 and a mediation scheme in 2015, which is supported by Post Office Limited and ministers. All of those did fail to resolve the issues, but left the court as the only way of providing the independent view that all sides needed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we can all agree that sub-postmasters are at the heart of our communities, and no much more so than in the communities I represent in Wednesbury, Oldbury and Tipton. And it is right, Mr. Speaker, that the Post Office can compete during challenging times. But can I ask my right honourable friend to reassure the sub-postmasters in my constituency that the government is going to continue to review the relationship the Post Office has with the sub-postmasters and make sure that they're given the protection and the respect that they are entitled to and deserve?
Grateful to my honourable friend for that. And indeed, one of the first things I said when I spoke to the Chief Exec was acknowledge the fact that we do need to, in order to build the relationship with postmasters of the future and give them the support they need, we need to make sure that we can right the wrongs of the past. But indeed, the Chief Exec has assured me, and his background would suggest, that actually he's used to working with sub-postmasters and as stakeholders, and I think that's key, what they need to be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Postmasters across the country have been fired, gone bankrupt and in some cases gone to prison. Given the scale of this injustice, with over 550 postmasters' families left in financial ruin, does the Minister agree that the current compensation, which fails to cover their legal costs, is neither fair nor just?
Yes. Agree that the fact is that so many people have suffered. Indeed, some people have taken their lives, and as well as losing their livelihoods, and that's not to be forgotten. In terms of the settlement, there was a settlement that I was pleased that was reached by both sides of this agreement. And as I say, sub-postmasters that have been caught within shortfalls of the past that were not in that are able to claim to the historic shortfall scheme.
May. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the great frustrations to date has been the refusal of the former senior management of the Post Office to answer detailed questions on this issue and to be held to account. And this is the least that is owed to those who have been wrongly convicted, including my constituent, Siobhan Sayer. Will my right honourable friend confirm that individual culpability of senior management figures within the Post Office will be part of this review?
Yeah, absolutely right.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I totally empathise with the suffering that Siobhan Sayer, his constituent. The independent chairman, who is independent of the Post Office and the government in this, needs to look at exactly what went wrong. When looking at what went wrong, that will by necessity need to look at who took what decisions and when, individuals. It's going to be complicated because this is something that happened over 20 years, a period of 20 years, but nonetheless, they must get to the bottom of it.
Heading to North of the Border with Miriam Fellows. Miriam Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. Post Office Limited has been allowed to destabilise the post office network by its underhand and legally dubious actions. This government must take up its responsibilities as a special shareholder in Post Office Limited and commission a judge-led inquiry. I make no apology for repeating that. Nothing less will do. Will this government help compensate those postmasters who have been obviously so wrongly convicted and help shore up the finances of Post Office Limited moving forward?
In terms of the finances, the government continues to work with the Post Office to work with its needs, to work with making sure that although it's an independent company, that it can actually work within its service obligations. In terms of the review, we recognise the hugely negative impact that the Horizon dispute had on the postmasters. But the financial settlement was a major step towards resolving some of those grievances. But there is more to be done. That's why we've launched the independent review, to ensure the lessons are learned and that they can never be repeated.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
This is one of the worst disasters in public life since the contaminated blood scandal. Does the Minister agree that if it's proven that Post Office executives were aware of the software faults but allowed innocent people to rot in jail, then they were guilty of criminal negligence and possibly criminal conspiracy, and therefore ought to be brought to justice. And will the proposed inquiry allow that to be done?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question. The IT system, Horizon, was put in place in 1999, with the first issues being raised in the early 2000s. And so that's over a long period of time. But Mr Justice Fraser considered what happened over that and set out his finding in considerable detail. And as I said, he has recommended some individuals to the Criminal Prosecution Service as well, referred them. And so moving forward, Post Office are now working to implement all the vital changes that's committed to under the leadership of its new CEO to reset the relationships with its postmasters are put in train.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many hundreds of postmasters were forced to pay back many thousands of pounds to the Post Office. Monies which were never in fact owed or indeed missing. That in itself, Mr Speaker, should trigger a criminal investigation. How much of that money went to pay the previous chief executive's £5 million salary? And tell me, Minister, why can you not accept that only a judge will get to the bottom of this miscarriage of justice?
I acknowledge the honourable gentleman's part not only in campaigning since being in this place for the plight of the postmasters, but his previous work as representing some of them in that court case. As I said, the important thing within this review is, does it find out what went wrong? Who made what decisions when? Does it make sure that it can't put anything, that it listens to the evidence of those that were wronged, get those voices out there to complement what Justice Fraser has said and to make sure that it can never happen again? That's the terms of an inquiry, that's the terms of a review. This independent chair will get to the bottom of that whilst being independent of government and the Post Office.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can't understand why the government want to prolong the agony on this by the halfway house of an independent review, and I had my calls for a judge-led review and one that progresses speedily. Does the Minister share my amazement that the Post Office, who have employed these postmasters and postmistresses for years and years and realised that they were decent, hard-working people, suddenly they didn't all become criminals? Did no one ask the questions? Mr Speaker, can we please get on with this and get the full judge-led inquiry now? Yes.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, and it's for that very reason that we've announced an independent review. A judge-led inquiry over the last 20 years, the shortest lasted 45 days. That was one minister dealing with two people. This is an incredibly complicated case. The longest inquiry is 13 years in the last 20 years. It cost £600 million in inquiries over the last 20 years. 30 years, forgive me. That is why we need something that will be reasonable in its timing, extensive in its remit, to make sure that we do get to the bottom of this at the appropriate time as quickly as possible.
We're now heading to Bedfordshire with Mohammed Yassin. Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID crisis has revealed what should have been obvious, that key workers, including postmasters, are essential workers and should have been treated with respect, not suspicion. Can the Minister tell me why his department failed to protect workers from a corporate governance failure of this magnitude, and how they will prevent such failure happening again?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that, and indeed government has challenged over the years, especially in recent years, as the Horizon situation came about over the 20 years. But in recently, as I said, in independent reviews in 2013, investigations in 2015, it has been because it's not been able to get a result that we've had to resort to the courts. But we do need to get to the bottom of this so that not only can we get right the wrongs of the postmasters of the past, but we can get the respect and of the future postmasters to know that they are secure within their positive relationship with the Post Office.
Kevin Holding-Ray.
Mr Speaker, I fear the cover-up could continue. The Post Office decided to bring in
Herbert Smith Freehills to oversee historic cases. This is a practice that contributed to the cover-up of a fraud at Lloyd's HBOS for 7 years. Also oversaw the establishment and the operation of the Lloyds Bank Customer Review, which is described by the FCA review of that scheme as discriminatory, as flawed, of an unacceptable denial of responsibility, and that's reviews having to be done over again. Do you think the Post Office should reconsider that decision?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that, and indeed we spoke about this earlier. The Post Office does, as you rightly say, decide on its own legal advisers. The Post Office, as far as I understand it, decided to change its advisers to Herbert Smith Freehills in the latter stages of the litigation, which resulted in the settlement and the good progress on resolving outstanding claimant issues and the successful launch of the historical shortfall scheme.
Going to Scotland with Alan Smith. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday from me also. We've seen some movement today from the government, and I do welcome that as far as it goes. But like the Equitable Life scandal, which is an ongoing deep injustice, like the people suffering under the loan charge presently, there is a consensus across the House that this just doesn't go far enough. Could I urge the Minister to build on the progress he's announced today, but accept the will of the House that we do need to see a judge-led inquiry into this to properly ventilate all the issues?
Minister. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. As I've said, I believe that the terms of reference of this review are deep enough to get to the bottom of exactly what has happened. The fact that the chairman is an independent, who will be appointed, is independent of government, is independent of the Post Office Limited, and will have the freedom to be able to go and find that evidence to complement the evidence that's already been published by Justice Fraser in his judgment. So there will be plenty to draw upon to actually come to the conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister not accept that this is as big a scandal, it ranks as big a scandal as the Guildford Four? And although the settlement was reached by mediation, which I approve of, much of that settlement was taken away in cash for lawyers. Can we not do something to make sure that the settlement justifies the indignities that many of these people have had to suffer?
In terms of the scale of the issue, I agree with my honourable friend how this has gone on for so long and taken on so many people who have suffered as a result, some with their lives, as we've heard. But the point is, the mediated settlement between the Post Office was between the Post Office and those sub-postmasters who took out that group litigation. I'm pleased that it came to a conclusion. But as a result of that, the government cannot enter into a new discussion with the Post Office on that basis.
Alistair Cartwright.
It's noble of the Minister to offer himself up as a human shield for Post Office in this way. But I hope that when he returns to the department today, he will tell his officials, who I fear have not maybe briefed him as well as they might have done, and tell also Post Office senior management that this review just isn't going to cut it. Yeah. The Minister says that this is a complex case spanning a long period of time, and he's absolutely right about that. That is why it requires a judge-led inquiry. And that's what will happen eventually. So why not just cut to the quick and do it now?
I keep hearing this. I keep hearing judge-led inquiry, and then I keep hearing that we need to move this on as quickly as possible. The point is that the terms of review reference within this review are the same as a judge-led inquiry. Because what I do not want is an inquiry that's going to last 13 years for sub-postmasters. If the sub-postmasters are going to come back and time again with no justice. This is something that I've been pushing on from the moment that I found out about it, or the detail about it, as Postal Affairs Minister. And this is why I'm going to drive this through to make sure that the answers are heard, that that independent chairman, independent of government, independent of Post Office, gets to the bottom of this and gets some answers.
Richard Greb.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, the Post Offices Limited closed their own review of Horizon IT by saying that there were, quote, no system-wide problems with our computer systems, unquote. Nothing could have been further from the truth. We have all been let down and many sub-postmasters have been badly treated. Can I urge the Minister to start the independent review as soon as possible to discover precisely who knew what when in Fujitsu, Post Offices Limited and the Federation of Sub-Postmasters? And does he agree with me that nothing should be ruled out, including criminal prosecution if justified?
I totally agree with my honourable friend, and indeed the criminal proceedings continue. The review into the those wrongly convicted continue as well, and this will sit along with Justice Fraser's findings. I do want to move this on as quickly as possible, not to rush anything, but just to make sure that those postmasters can get those answers and bring the injustice to an end.
Heading up to Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, and I add my support for a proper judge-led inquiry too. Della Robinson was sub-postmaster at Duckinfield Post Office. She lost her business, the building the post office was in, her rental property, her job and almost her home. Just wrong. So can the Minister confirm that the government is re-evaluating any public positions held by current or former senior employees at the post office who are intimately involved in decisions which victimise sub-postmasters?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman for that question, and I'm aware that a former chief exec of the Post Office took up a role as executive director at the Cabinet Office until she stood down. I'm also aware that that the Care Quality Commission has written to Imperial following a fit and proper persons referral, and the CQC is considering this. Lord Callanan has written to the DHSC on the 18th of May to draw the department's attention to the strength of feeling around the former chief exec of the Post Office position within the NHS.
Andrew Jones.
Yeah. Post offices are at the heart of our communities, yet the postmasters, postmistresses have been so badly let down. I share the anger clearly across the House on this issue. But to keep the network open and viable, it must be attractive to take on a post office franchise. To do that, I think it is a critical question of rebuilding trust. So as he holds the post office to account, will he hold them to account on how they are rebuilding trust with all of the sub-postmasters and postmistresses right across the network?
I thank my honourable friend for that, and I absolutely agree with him. And that's why my conversations, some of my first conversations with Nick Reed, the current chief exec of the Post Office, is to make sure that he can ensure exactly that. We need to draw the line and right the wrongs of the past to give the respect and trust for future postmasters, but also the support for them as well. Make sure they are valued stakeholders.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many innocent sub-postmasters and mistresses have been bankrupted and imprisoned due to the Post Office's heavy-handed approach and wrongly accused of theft when accountancy issues with Horizon reported financial irregularities. And sadly, one of my constituents tragically took his own life after being falsely accused of financial impropriety, leaving his family destitute and without their business. It's too late for an apology or compensation for this family. So, Mr. Minister, what new procedures have the Post Office introduced to protect postmasters and mistresses as a consequence of this scandal? And what protections has the Post Office put in place to ensure accountancy software is fit for purpose? And what action will be taken against those in positions of leadership in the Post Office during this scandal? And would the Minister agree with me that actions speak much louder than words?
I sympathise with the Honourable Lady's constituent who sadly took her life, and that's one of many tragic stories. And indeed, this is exactly what the fact is that we've now got the Post Office to accept its wrong position. The fact that the Horizon software could make mistakes, that things were being changed there, and that is why it's important to get that acknowledgement. But it's also important that we continue to build trust with sub-postmasters and the relationship with the Post Office, and that's what I make sure that every time I speak to the Chief Exec, that is top of our agenda.
Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, if the government accepts that software can never be thought infallible, will the Minister take steps to ensure that the law and policy making reflects the truth that all software has bugs.
I thank my honourable friend, and will of course review that and keep that in our mind.
Manjeet Singh Desik.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. The Post Office Horizon scandal begs the question: why didn't the Post Office believe its own postmasters, many sub-postmasters, many of whom had given decades of loyal service, even after evidence was presented to them that the Horizon system was most likely faulty? And can the Secretary of State give a cast-iron guarantee, as other honourable and right honourable members have requested, to all those sub-postmasters and their families whose lives have been ruined, that there will be a judge-led inquiry, not merely a review, so that we can ascertain how this happened, who is responsible, and what steps can be taken to ensure that this never happens again? I thank my honourable gentleman for that promotion, the Secretary of State, but look, he raises some really important points, and the point is, whether you call it a review or inquiry, the terms of reference are exactly as he describes. We do want to make sure that we can get to the bottom of this, find out who made what decisions, how they were made, and that they can never happen again. That's exactly why I've pushed to make this happen as soon as possible.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isabella Wall was a sub-postmistress in Barrow. She ran a thriving shop, let flats above the property, but as a result of the scandal, she lost everything. She was the very first person to come and see me at a surgery as a newly elected MP, and I carry the anger that she brought to that meeting with me. Does my right honourable friend accept that whilst the Post Office has accepted it's got things wrong, there is a long, long way to go for people like Miss Wall before they're properly compensated for the financial and the emotional losses they faced? Will he confirm that the government will give weight to fair compensation being paid to wrong sub-postmasters and mistresses?
Isabel Wall is just one of a number of far too many constituents of ours who have suffered from this, and the honourable gentleman opposite was right when he talked about the fact that the Post Office should have had more faith and trust in its post office masters. And of course we will make sure that we can get to the bottom of this to get some justice for Isabel Wall. In terms of the group litigation, as I said, I'm glad that they've reached a review. Sub-postmasters who a settlement. In terms of sub-postmasters who have not yet been part of a case but may have suffered a shortfall, I do encourage them to come forward to take advantage of the historic shortfall scheme which the Post Office launched.
Heading to Scotland with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Many happy returns, Mr. Speaker. There is no doubt that there have been many grave injustices served upon sub-postmasters and mistresses, some of whom have gone to jail and lost everything. I know my constituents in Airdrie and Shotts will want two things. First, to see justice done and the full facts brought out in a public inquiry, which is why a judge-led public inquiry is so important. But they will also want to see their local post office network protected and ensure the network is shielded from the potential ramifications of the actions of management. So what plan does the Minister have to ensure both?
In terms of the inquiry, I've set out the fact that the terms of reference are wide and deep enough. In terms of a judge, the judge has already reviewed this situation. Justice Fraser has already come up with many pages of response about what happened when and what went wrong. We need to make sure that we can build on that evidence, listen very, very carefully to those who have been wronged, and make sure it can never happen again.
Heading to Bob Blackman in Harrow. Bob Blackman.
Happy birthday, Mr. Speaker. We are all aware that victims of this scandal have lost their livelihoods, their savings, their reputations, and some their liberty as a result of a faulty computer system. I know my honourable friend understands the financial and emotional suffering that the Horizon litigation has brought upon the victims. Does my honourable friend agree that actually the only right and just situation will be to restore those victims to exactly the financial position they would have been in had this faulty system not occurred? Full compensation, an apology, and equally the real criminals brought to justice.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and the point he raises, as I say, is that this is why it took a court to get to the bottom of this, to actually break the deadlock that was happening over so many years, which should have been settled so much earlier. And that's why in December 29, both parties in the group litigation agreed a settlement following several days of mediation, which is financial settlement totaling £57.75 million. Convicted claimants can still go through a further process as well, where there are processes in place for them to receive compensation if appropriate.
Returning to Scotland with Dave Dugan. Dave Dugan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Post Office was not slow in dragging hard-working, honest sub-postmasters and mistresses before the courts based on spurious data from a flawed IT system, and one which they knew to be flawed, thereby depriving good people at the centre of their communities of their reputations, their businesses, their personal assets, in some instances their liberty, and tragically for some their lives. Does the Minister accept that a judge-led public inquiry, not a review, is required now without delay, and that anything less is a further assault on the welfare of Horizon victims?
Minister. The findings outlined during the Horizon case provided extensive insight already as to what went wrong with the Post Office, including the independent judicial review of the facts that all sides have been looking for. But because of the serious impacts of this case, that's why more needs to be done. We want to be assured that the right lessons are learned, and that's the purpose of the independent review that we're in the process of setting up.
Morrissey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister join me in paying tribute to the postmasters in Beaconsfield and Bucks and across the country who have tirelessly carried on throughout COVID-19? And will you join me in paying tribute to Mr. Patel, who passed away from COVID-19 and served the people of Hedgeley loyally, lovingly known as CD to many of the customers? And as we think of justice, will you please not only demand an apology, but demand justice for the countless men and women who served and have suffered at the hands of the Post Office, and they see no justice, and I hope that you will have the courage to deliver that for them.
I thank my honourable friend, and justice is exactly what I want to be seen to be done. And I would go further to extend my sympathy to the family of Mr. Patel as well, because we mustn't forget in all of this, at this particular moment in time, postmasters up and down in the country are doing an incredible job for the most vulnerable people in society.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. At Prime Minister's questions on the 24th of February, the Prime Minister agreed with me to commit to holding an independent inquiry into this horrific scandal. I followed this question up with a letter to the Prime Minister. 3 months later, I received a response from the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite just this week. I welcome the Government's commitment into a review of mishandlings, but this cannot just be a review into past mistakes. With a background of many years in the postal industry, I know many whose lives have been destroyed by this scandal, including sub-postmasters and mistresses in my constituency of Jarrow. So I ask him again, and I make absolutely no apology for doing so. Will the Minister commit to having a judge-led review as quickly as possible that will take action against those responsible for the scandal and ensure that each individual case is assessed and proper compensation is paid to all of those affected?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for the work that she's done on this matter, and given her background as well, I can understand her motivation. But it's important to know, as I say, this independent review is wide enough and deep enough in terms of its terms of reference to get to the bottom of what happened. An independent judge has already looked at the evidence and built up that body of evidence, their views, which will then be looked in complement to this. Don't forget, public inquiries can't determine criminal or civil guilt in themselves. That's reserved for a court.
Mahendra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy birthday. As many colleagues have alluded to in the House today, we've seen the importance of postal submasters during this global pandemic. What reassurance can my honourable friend give that the Post Office Limited has understood that there needs to be fundamental cultural and organisational change to ensure that postmasters and sub-postmasters come forward to ensure that critical network of post offices remains in our communities for years to come?
Minister.
Thank you, honourable friend. And I think that lesson has definitely been learnt by the new chief executive, and it certainly is in terms of the government. The government has worked as the shareholders, working with a new framework with the Post Office to make sure that we can build a solid, confident relationship with future sub-postmasters. Nick Reed's background working with independent convenience stores, I think, demonstrates the fact, or suggests the fact, that he's used to working with people as stakeholders rather than as simple employees or instruments of a large company.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. The Minister has said several times at the dispatch box that the victims of this situation need to be heard and their cases listened to. So, can the Minister name any one of them that is in agreement with his position and is not calling for an independent judge-led inquiry?
Minister.
I think if the sub-postmasters that have been wronged by this want some justice, and they want it quickly. What I don't want to happen is a public inquiry that may take many years, cost a lot of money for them to get more legal representation in. When they've had the chance to study this terms of reference, they realise that the chair will be independent of government. It will be independent of the Post Office. He will actually, or her, will actually listen to to those people to make sure their stories are told, not just to listen to them, but make sure those stories are actually there to feed into making sure this can never happen again. Then I hope they will see that justice can be done.
Yeah. I think we learned from my honourable friend the Minister's response to my honourable friend for Cleethorpes that one of the stumbling blocks to a judge-led inquiry is cost. Does he agree with me that it is absolutely imperative that the honest, decent sub-postmasters and mistresses of the whole of the country, and indeed specifically in Romsey and Southampton North, should not have a price put on lifting the stain on their characters?
Yeah.
I thank the honourable lady for that, honourable friend for that question. Members that have been wronged, sub-postmasters that have been wronged, including in Romsey, need to make sure that their voices can be heard in a good time, quickly as well, with no cost, and actually make sure that this can never happen again, and they can have acknowledgement that there have been severe mistakes that have caused misery for so many.
Back to Scotland with Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This scandal represents a massive failure of accountability and oversight, not just by Post Office Limited, but also by government. So will the Minister apologise to those whose lives have been ruined? And what assurances can he give that the losses arising from the Horizon case doesn't affect postmasters' pay and therefore unfairly penalise even more postmasters and sub-postmasters?
Thank the honourable gentleman. There's been numerous attempts, as I say, over the years to try and resolve the dispute. The fact is that the Post Office has independent operational control. But in hindsight, facts have come through the litigation, which has revealed that advice that the government has received and the shareholders received over that period was flawed. So that's why government's going to be monitoring closely the progress of Post Office in delivering the programme of commitments following that settlement, including through the review. We've also reviewed our mechanisms in place to maintain oversight of the Post Office by increasing the frequency of shareholder meetings, establishing a Post Office policy team within BEIS, and publishing a framework document to govern the relationship between BEIS, UKGI and the Post Office.
Staying in Scotland with Amy Callaghan. Amy Callaghan.
A very happy birthday to you, Mr. Speaker. This government have had 6 months to enact an inquiry, 6 months to seek justice for the damage, disruption and loss of livelihood caused by this scandal, not just to see if the Post Office has learned lessons. The Secretary of State has said he pushed for this independent review, but what about listening to the sub-postmasters who have been left destitute by this scandal and provide them with the judge-led inquiry they so desperately want? So will the Secretary of State stop stalling with reviews and commit to this judge-led inquiry today?
We can talk about semantics. What I think we need is actually terms of reference that actually gets people what they want. And a review, whether you call it a review, whether you call it a inquiry, the fact is that this does understand and acknowledge what went wrong in relation to Horizon. By drawing on the evidence, it will assess whether the Post Office has learnt its lessons. It will assess whether the commitments made by the Post Office within the mediation settlement have been properly delivered, and assess whether the processes and information provided by Post Offices to postmasters are sufficient to make make sure, and it's also examine the governance and whistleblowing controls now in place at Post Office Limited. These are the answers that we need to make sure that we can get in a timely fashion as possible. I'm sorry it's taken 6 months. If it'd been, these things are complicated, and I'd love to have announced it that following day. But I'm glad now we have terms of reference which I believe are deep enough and wide enough to get the answers we need and sub-postmasters desperately be waiting for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend, the Minister, is quite right to emphasise the need for speed. But, Mr. Speaker, people have taken their own lives. They've been wrongly convicted and imprisoned. It doesn't get much more serious than that. And this House is here to defend the liberties of our constituents. Will he also bear in mind that the Prime Minister confirmed on the 26th of February that there would indeed be an inquiry? And following this urgent question today, will he discuss with his colleagues in government whether the will of the House may be different on this point from the will of the government?
Indeed, we've looked at the different options, and what I do not want, as I say, is something that is long, drawn out and costly for sub-postmasters, which doesn't necessarily get the answers for years and years and years to come, if ever. Someone used to say to me, there's a phrase, less haste, more speed. So yes, we need to make sure that we can do this in a timely fashion, but that doesn't mean we need to rush through the detail as the review is going ahead. We need to listen to the views of the sub-postmasters that have been wronged. We need to put that alongside the findings of Justice Fraser to make sure that this will never happen again.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday to you too. Government speak as if there's nothing they could have done as a special shareholder. Well, of course there could. It's left communities in York like Clifton now bereft of a post office. The fact is the government sat on its hands, didn't use its powers, as submasters and submistresses were thrown into jail, made bankrupt, and for some, they took their lives. Does the government not want a full judge-led inquiry with the powers necessary to investigate and dig deep? Because a review itself does not hold those powers, because it will expose their failings in this matter.
The Post Office has said that it will comply fully with this. I will push fully for that compliance as well, and I'm sure the independent chair will want to get right to the bottom of this, however long it takes. But we do need to get on with it and get it started now. In terms of the government's actions over the past few years, as I say, this is something that's happened over 20 years. With hindsight, facts have come to light, as I say, that over litigation that some advice has received that's been flawed, but we have pushed to make sure that we can get a settlement for many, many years, and I'm glad that we're at the point that we can start to get some answers.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a barrister of over 30 years' experience, I have to say I've witnessed at first hand the sheer devastation that a wrong conviction or even an accusation that is false brings upon a family. This is the United Kingdom. This is an injustice. Can I be assured by the Minister that following the review, there are very real sanctions that follow on, because this has effectively destroyed a much-loved public institution?
I thank the honourable friend for that question, and she's right when she talks about the much-loved institution, because what we mustn't lose within this, that the Post Office is doing amazing work, sub-postmasters are doing amazing work up and down this country, and we mustn't make sure that their reputation is tarnished with the actions of what's happened over a 20-year period. We do need to have those answers as quickly as we can, so that I can see and government can see and we can all see what those recommendations are that the chairman will come forward from that review.
We now come to Dr. Rupa.
Many happy returns from me too, Mr. Speaker. For the Patels, moving from being managers of Acton Crown Post Office for over 3 decades to their own sub-postmaster role in the country was meant to be a dream come true. But it turned into a nightmare when they lost not only substantial sums, but their mental and physical health, their reputations. He ended up with a criminal electronic tag on, the humiliation of it. So they want to know, why in Acton for over 20 years were they seen as upstanding pillars of the community? You know, they handled multi-million sums and a safe key. Then suddenly in Oxfordshire, they were falsely branded as criminals. Why did it take the Criminal Review Case Commission to say that this is now a miscarriage of justice? Where was the oversight? And finally, Can you make good on the promise Paula Venables gave to me in 2018 that Acton Crown Post Office will be reopened? It closed on her watch, and she's done a runner since then.
Minister. In terms of closures, post offices that have got the most stable network that we've had for a number of years now. So that's something, obviously, with COVID-19 notwithstanding, we need to make sure we can build on. But I want to find those answers as well about why the 3 Patels that she described to her constituents, who were fine, upstanding members of the community, were seen as that because of the actions of the post office. That's why we need to get this review done. That's why we need to get the recommendations out by the independent chairman as well, so that we can see justice done.
42 withdrawn. Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and many happy returns of the day. Mr. Speaker, the scale of this scandal demands no less than a judge-led inquiry that has appropriate power. So why can't the Minister accept that this is the only way to fully examine, get answers, and into how this sorry saga went on for so long and caused so much misery and heartache to constituents of mine and thousands more across the country?
Minister.
Thank the honourable gentleman. We have 1,000 pages of findings by Justice Fraser to build on. We have the criminal convictions that are going through, the reviews, that are going through to overturn and look at a number of convictions. We have this review to build on all of that, and then all of that body of work will, I hope and believe, will find the answers that sub-postmasters are after about when decisions were taken, who took those decisions, how they went wrong, how they were allowed to go wrong, and the fact is that we get some answers so it can never happen again.
Speaker, I think the Minister is doing an excellent job, and I have been in his position where I have announced a review but I wasn't allowed to call it a review. So I appreciate that he might think that it's just semantics, the difference between a review and an inquiry, but for many people those semantics really matter. And so I share colleagues' views about the need for an independent inquiry. But I would also like to know what the Minister is going to do about the financial compensation, because I appreciate that he has said that there's limits on what government can do. But I do think it's really important that he does look again at this issue and he sees what steps can be taken to ensure that those affected are fully and fairly compensated.
Minister.
Well, in terms of compensation, as I say, the mediation that took place allowed a settlement to be reached by the members of that group litigation, and other members, other sub-postmasters who have been found to be wrongly convicted will have other procedures that they can go through to get the compensation. And indeed, any postmasters that feel that they weren't part of that litigation but suffered a shortfall as a result of the Post Office will be able to apply to the historic scheme. The point is, though, about the inquiry and the review is that I believe this review will be able to get to the answers, will be able to build on the body of evidence that Justice Fraser has built up throughout his findings through his court case as well. So there will be a lot of answers there for recommendations to come forward to secure the future of the trust and relationship with postmasters at the Post Office.
Going back to Scotland with Douglas Chapman. Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and a happy birthday to you too. Following this case being taken to the High Court, I have read that some Fujitsu employees are being investigated for perjury, which I think is a big deal. What discussions has the Minister had with the Attorney General and the Department of Justice on this issue, and when will he announce a judge-led inquiry into this whole sorry debacle?
My understanding is that Justice Fraser has referred a number of people to the Criminal Prosecution Service.
We now come to Derek Thomas.
I do hope that all the time taken to wish her happy birthday has not delayed any celebration you might have planned for later. So I want to raise a case which is one of many. Susan Knight was a postmistress of 32 years who was dragged before magistrates' courts 3 times, Truro Crown Court twice, made to pay £20,000, over £20,000. This lady's life was made a misery, her reputation trashed, and 32 years of service to the Post Office counting for nothing. It's too late for her to rebuild her business. She is basically left with nothing. Having heard what the Minister has said today, can he assure me and my constituents and Susan Knight that she will be adequately compensated in good time without a huge effort to try and achieve this result?
Minister.
I thank the honourable friend for that comment. And the Susan Knight, and indeed he was telling me about another constituent of his who was a landlady of a local pub who lost that pub, and it was another story, a terrible story that we've heard alongside members from all sides of the House about their constituents. In terms of the compensation, members of the group litigation scheme joined in that settlement. I'm pleased that the settlement was reached after many years and deadlock was broken. But as I said, if anybody else that hasn't claimed can join the historic shortfall scheme, and if the people who've been wrongly convicted, there will be procedures in place for them to actually claim compensation via that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy birthday. So while the Post Office were willfully hiding their own failings, they operated a system that the sub-postmasters were automatically guilty. The Post Office then ran their own prosecutions, so in effect they were judge, jury and executioner. So this proves that we need a judge-led public inquiry with all the powers associated with that can get full disclosure and call for evidence. But in the meantime, can you tell me what steps the government have taken to ensure that this abuse of power can never be replicated and that sub-postmasters now have contracts that are fair and transparent?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and Justice Fraser is that independent judge that has looked into exactly those positions that he described, and that's why we want to build on those findings in terms of what happens next. The Post Office has realised and finally come up to acknowledged that it is done wrong, and the fact is that we do need to make sure within our new relationship, our new framework as government, as the sole shareholder of the Post Office, that we can analyse the work that is done to earn the trust and rebuild that relationship with future sub-postmasters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The biggest disgrace about all of this is where innocent people have been incarcerated and imprisoned. Could I ask the Minister to confirm if there are any sub-postmasters or mistresses who are currently in prison, and if that is the case, will he commit to expedite immediately a full investigation into their specific cases for their release, if that is appropriate?
What we're not going to do in terms of the review is to get into the way in the way of the Criminal Case Review Commission. It's really important that they do actually go through that process as quickly as possible, not just for any number of reasons, not least to lift the conviction of people wrongly convicted. But he's absolutely right to decry the fact that people have been put in prison wrongly. And their reputation suffered, their lives suffered, and indeed, in certain cases, their lives ended. That's why I want to make sure that we can get on and set this review up and find those answers to move forward.
Mr. Speaker, if the review that he proposes is just as deep and wide-ranging and going into the complexities than a judge-led inquiry, the question is why it should be less time-consuming and more cost-effective than a judge-led inquiry. I understand the government always says no before it says yes, so for a last time today, will he commit to a judge-led inquiry?
I can give you one easy answer why it takes so long, and that's lawyers. If you have a public inquiry, you tend to get a lot of expense that both sides lawyering up, to use the vernacular. That's why the 600 million quid been spent in the last 30 years on public inquiries. Now, we can either spend a lot of time and a lot of working on that, or we can get through a review, build on the independent judge that has already looked at this case, that has already built up the foundations, and making sure that we can add to that by listening to the voices of those people that have gone through absolute hell.
Penultimate question, Colm McCann.
Hearty birthday felicitations, Speaker. Throughout the financial and emotional suffering the Horizon process has caused postmasters and their families across the country, I have been kept informed of developments by the Belgate Post Office submaster Simon Clark in my constituency of Lincoln. Can my honourable friend tell me, and the House, how many senior managers responsible for the position the Post Office have taken have resigned or been sanctioned or had any bonus payments revoked?
I think one of the problems with this, I thank my honourable friend, because one of the problems with this case is that it's happened over 20 years. And so actually this has meant that a lot of people moved on, that have gone round, and it's been difficult to follow the people that have gone through the system at all this point in time. This is why, though, I hear from a sedentary position giving the former chief exec the CBE. This is why we followed that up. That she went through the Independent Honours Commission, who worked on that in a separate process. But we actually have made sure that we've written to ask if she's a fit and proper person in terms of the CQC and the positions that we've had that she now holds.
Final question, Lucian.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate you including me on the call list. I sympathise with my right honourable friend, and I know that he will have heard what has been said today and will be listening very carefully. A succession of his predecessors have come to that dispatch box over years to read out statements from officials we know had closely connected relationships with Post Office management and who knew that an injustice had occurred. What will he do to tackle the network of intertwined vested interests that are on his doorstep, and I include the Cabinet Office and ex-Fujitsu employees, which led to this shameful and tragic scandal and cover-up?
What we're making sure we do is that maybe many government ministers come here. It's this government minister that's actually pushed to make sure that we can have a review, that we can have an independently chaired review, separate from the Post Office, separate from government, to come up with those answers. That's what postmasters want. We've made sure in government that we've come up with a new framework for an increased frequency of shareholder meetings as well, to make sure that we can hold Post Office to account for its actions, but also make sure that the taxpayer gets the most out of the Post Office, that the communities get the most of the out of the Post Office, but importantly, that postmasters can feel confident that they can build up a trustful relationship as valued stakeholders within that Post Office network.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrivals of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.